Before you count sheep, count mysteries.
For decades, one name has haunted America: the Zodiac Killer. Between 1968 and 1969, a mysterious serial killer terrorized Northern California, leaving behind a trail of fear, cryptic letters, and unsolved murders. He contacted newspapers, challenged the police, and sent encrypted messages that continue to puzzle investigators more than 50 years later. Despite one of the most extensive investigations in American history, no one has ever been officially identified as the Zodiac Killer. Who was the man behind the mask? How did he disappear without a trace? And is it possible that the truth has been hiding in plain sight all along? Tonight, we uncover one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in criminal history. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer. On the surface, Northern California in the late 1960s seemed like an ideal place to live. It was a time of growing suburbs, family neighborhoods, and quiet communities where violent crime was still considered relatively rare. Teenagers spent their weekends at drive-in theaters, diners, or simply driving through the countryside with friends. Parents believed their children were safe. Police departments focused on routine crime, never expecting that history was about to take a terrifying turn. No one knew that a single unknown man would soon become one of the most infamous criminals America had ever seen. The story began on the evening of December 20th, 1968. 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen had planned nothing unusual. Like many young couples their age, they simply wanted to spend time together before Christmas. They drove to a remote area on the outskirts of Vallejo, California, a quiet lover's lane known locally as Lake Herman Road. The road was dark and isolated. There were no streetlights. Only the occasional headlights of passing cars disturbed the silence. For David and Betty Lou, it was just another teenage date. They had no reason to feel afraid. At approximately 11 o'clock that night, another vehicle entered the area. Investigators believe the driver may have stopped briefly before leaving, only to return a few minutes later. This time, he parked behind the couple's Rambler station wagon. He stepped out of his vehicle. No one knows exactly what happened during the next few seconds. There were no surviving witnesses, but the physical evidence painted a horrifying picture. David Faraday was ordered out of the car. Moments later, he was shot once in the head at close range. He collapsed beside the vehicle and died almost instantly. Betty Lou Jensen reacted differently. Instead of freezing, she ran. She sprinted into the darkness, desperately trying to escape the gunman. But she never stood a chance. The killer fired multiple rounds. Several bullets struck her in the back as she fled. She collapsed roughly 30 feet away from the car. By the time help arrived, both teenagers were dead. Detectives quickly secured the scene, searching for fingerprints, footprints, shell casings, and anything that could identify the murderer. They found spent .22 caliber shell casings. They interviewed nearby residents. They questioned friends and family. Yet every lead seemed to disappear almost as quickly as it appeared. There was no obvious motive. The victims had not been robbed. There were no signs of a personal dispute. Nothing suggested that David or Betty Lou had been specifically targeted. To investigators, it looked like a completely random act of violence. At first, police believed they were dealing with an isolated double homicide, a tragic crime, but one that would eventually be solved. They had no idea that the man responsible was far from finished. Just months later, he would strike again. But this time, he wouldn't stop with murder. He would introduce himself to the world, and from that moment forward, the name Zodiac would become part of criminal history forever. For more than 6 months after the murders on Lake Herman Road, investigators worked tirelessly to identify the killer. Detectives interviewed witnesses, examined every piece of physical evidence, and followed countless leads. Yet despite their efforts, the investigation slowly began to lose momentum. Without a suspect, the case grew colder with every passing week. Many believed the murderer had either fled the area or would never kill again. They were wrong. On the night of July 4th, 1969, while millions of Americans celebrated Independence Day with fireworks and family gatherings, another young couple drove to a secluded parking area known as Blue Rock Springs Park, just a few miles from the site of the first murders. 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin and 19-year-old Michael Mageau had parked their car shortly before midnight. It was a quiet summer evening. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, at approximately 11:50 p.m., another vehicle slowly entered the parking lot. The driver pulled in behind the couple's car. For several moments, he remained completely still. Then, without warning, he drove away. Darlene and Michael believed the stranger had simply left. But only a few minutes later, the headlights returned. The same vehicle pulled up once again and stopped directly behind them. This time, the driver stepped out carrying a flashlight. At first, Michael believed it was a police officer approaching the vehicle. The bright beam of light was pointed directly into their faces, making it impossible to see who was standing outside. Then the man suddenly raised a handgun. Without saying a single word, he opened fire. Bullets shattered the windows. Both victims were struck multiple times. Believing they were dead, the gunman calmly turned and walked back toward his car. But then he heard movement. Michael Mageau was still alive. The killer returned. He walked back to the passenger side of the vehicle and fired several more shots at point-blank range before disappearing into the darkness. This time, however, his plan was not perfect. Against all odds, Michael Mageau survived. Severely wounded, he would later provide detectives with the first eyewitness description of the mysterious gunman. He described a heavy-set white male, somewhere between 26 and 30 years old, with a broad face and short hair. It wasn't much, but for the first time, police finally had something. Yet the most shocking moment of the entire investigation was still to come. Less than an hour after the attack, the Vallejo Police Department received a phone call. The anonymous caller spoke calmly. He gave the exact location of the victims. Then he made a chilling confession. "I want to report a double murder." He admitted responsibility not only for the attack at Blue Rock Springs, but also for the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen 6 months earlier. When the dispatcher asked for his identity, the caller simply hung up. At that moment, investigators realized something terrifying. They were no longer searching for the killer responsible for one unsolved case. They were hunting someone who had already killed multiple times, someone who appeared completely fearless, and someone who wanted the police to know he was still out there. They still didn't know his name, but very soon, the killer would choose one for himself. The phone call to the Vallejo Police Department changed everything. For the first time, investigators knew they were dealing with someone who wasn't simply trying to escape justice. He wanted attention, he wanted recognition, and above all, he wanted the world to fear him. Less than a month after the attack at Blue Rock Springs, 3 nearly identical letters arrived at the offices of 3 Northern California newspapers. One was sent to the Vallejo Times-Herald, another to the San Francisco Chronicle, and the third to the San Francisco Examiner. Each envelope contained a handwritten letter, but there was something else inside, a strange cryptogram. Each newspaper had received only one part of a much larger encrypted message. Together, the 3 pieces formed a 408-character cipher unlike anything most journalists had ever seen. The anonymous writer made an extraordinary demand. He ordered every newspaper to publish his cipher on the front page. If they refused, he claimed he would go on another killing spree. If you do not print this cipher by the afternoon of Friday, I will go on a kill rampage. The threat immediately captured public attention. Editors faced an impossible decision: ignore the demands, or publish the words of a murderer. Ultimately, they chose to publish the letters. Millions of Americans suddenly found themselves staring at a mysterious code that nobody could understand. The killer claimed that solving the cipher would reveal his identity. Police cryptographers attempted to crack it. Military intelligence examined the message. Even the FBI became involved. But day after day, the cipher remained unsolved. Surprisingly, the breakthrough didn't come from professional investigators. It came from an ordinary married couple. Donald and Betty Hardin, school teachers from Salinas, California, became fascinated by the challenge. Working together from their dining room table, they searched for repeating patterns and common English words. Slowly, the seemingly impossible puzzle began to make sense. After days of careful analysis, they successfully decrypted almost the entire message. What they discovered shocked the nation. The writer claimed that killing people gave him pleasure. He described murder as more exciting than hunting wild animals. He even suggested that his victims would become his servants in the afterlife. Yet despite promising to reveal his identity, he never actually included his name. The final portion of the cipher appeared deliberately scrambled, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Then, on August 7th, 1969, another letter arrived. This one was different. At the very beginning, the writer introduced himself with a sentence that would become one of the most infamous lines in criminal history. "This is the Zodiac speaking." For the first time, the mysterious killer had given himself a name. From that moment forward, newspapers across America no longer referred to him as an unknown murderer. He became the Zodiac Killer. Detectives now faced an entirely different kind of criminal. He wasn't hiding from the spotlight. He was creating his own legend. Every letter, every cipher, every threat was carefully designed to spread fear across California, and while police struggled to understand the man behind the messages, Zodiac was already planning his next move, a move that would prove he was willing to attack almost anyone, anywhere, even in broad daylight. By the autumn of 1969, fear had spread across Northern California. Newspapers covered every new development. Families locked their doors earlier than ever before. Couples stopped visiting secluded lovers' lanes, wondering if the mysterious killer was watching from the darkness. Yet despite the nationwide attention, the Zodiac Killer remained invisible. No confirmed photograph. No fingerprints that could identify him. No name. Only letters, threats, and growing fear. Then on September 27, 1969, the Zodiac changed his method once again. That afternoon, 22-year-old Brian Hartnell and 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard were enjoying a quiet picnic near the shores of Lake Berryessa. It was a warm Saturday. The lake was peaceful. Families were fishing. Boats drifted slowly across the water. Nothing suggested that within the next hour, one of the most terrifying encounters in American criminal history would unfold. Around 6:30 p.m., Cecilia noticed a man watching them from a distance. At first, he appeared to be wandering aimlessly among the trees. Then he disappeared. Minutes later, he returned, but this time, he looked completely different. The stranger was dressed entirely in black. Covering his head was an executioner-style hood. Sewn onto the chest of his costume was a strange white symbol, a circle, crossed by intersecting lines, the same symbol that had appeared beneath his letters to the newspapers. Brian later recalled that the man calmly approached them carrying a handgun. Surprisingly, he did not immediately attack. Instead, he spoke in a controlled, almost polite voice. He claimed he was an escaped convict. He said he needed money and a vehicle to escape to Mexico. Brian believed him. Hoping to avoid violence, he cooperated. The masked man ordered Cecilia to tie Brian's hands with a length of plastic clothesline. Unsatisfied with the knots, he calmly retied them himself. Then he bound Cecilia as well. Neither of them realized that robbery had never been his true intention. Once both victims were helpless, the man reached into his pocket. He pulled out a large knife. Without warning, he began stabbing Brian repeatedly. Then he turned toward Cecilia. She screamed for help. The isolated shoreline answered only with silence. The attacker stabbed her again and again and again. In total, both victims suffered numerous devastating wounds. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the killer walked away. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He simply disappeared into the trees. But before leaving the area, he stopped beside Brian's white Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. Using a black marker, he calmly wrote on the driver's door. He listed the dates of his previous attacks, then added the words September 27th, 1969, 6:30, and beneath them, he drew the Zodiac symbol. It was his signature, his way of claiming ownership, a message to investigators that this attack belonged to him. Against incredible odds, Brian Hartnell survived. He would later provide detectives with one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts ever obtained in the investigation. Cecilia Shepard was transported to hospital alive. Doctors fought desperately to save her. But 2 days later, she died from her injuries. Once again, the Zodiac Killer had vanished, yet he wasn't finished. Less than 3 weeks later, he would commit perhaps his boldest crime yet. Not on an isolated country road, not beside a quiet lake, but in the heart of San Francisco, in broad daylight. By the end of 1969, the Zodiac Killer had become one of the most feared men in America. His murders had shocked California. His letters had terrified the public. His ciphers had frustrated investigators. Yet, despite months of relentless investigation, the man behind the Zodiac symbol remained a ghost. Detectives followed hundreds of leads. Thousands of tips poured into police departments across California. Every new suspect seemed convincing, until the evidence fell apart. Over the years, dozens of names were linked to the case, but one suspect stood above all the others: Arthur Lee Allen. Allen first attracted investigators because of his unusual behavior and disturbing interests. Friends later claimed he had spoken about wanting to hunt people, He owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch displaying a symbol remarkably similar to the one used in the killer's letters. Former acquaintances described him as intelligent, manipulative, and deeply unsettling. As detectives continued digging into his past, the list of suspicious coincidences seemed to grow. Yet every time investigators believed they were getting closer, the evidence failed to deliver a definitive answer. His fingerprints did not conclusively match those recovered from the crime scenes. His handwriting could never be positively identified as the authors of the Zodiac letters, and years later, DNA testing also failed to provide the certainty investigators desperately hoped for. Some detectives remain convinced Allen was the Zodiac Killer. Others believe the real murderer had never even appeared on the list of suspects. The debate continues to this day. Over the decades, countless books, documentaries, and independent investigations have proposed new theories. Some claim the Zodiac acted alone. Others believe more than one person may have been involved. Amateur codebreakers continue searching for hidden messages inside the killer's ciphers. Advances in forensic science have reopened hope more than once. Modern DNA analysis, digital fingerprint databases, artificial intelligence, each new technology has promised answers. Yet every breakthrough has led investigators back to the same place: uncertainty. Officially, the Zodiac Killer has never been identified. The murders remain among the most famous unsolved crimes in American history. More than half a century has passed since the first shots echoed along Lake Herman Road. Many of the detectives who worked the original investigation are gone. Witnesses have grown old. Some suspects have died. But the mystery remains. Somewhere, the truth still exists. Perhaps hidden in a forgotten police file. Perhaps buried inside evidence that modern science has yet to unlock. Or perhaps the man known as Zodiac carried his identity to the grave. We may never know who he truly was. But his crimes changed criminal investigations forever. They inspired generations of detectives, cryptographers, journalists, and historians to keep searching for answers. Someone will finally solve this mystery. But until then, don't count sheep. Count mysteries.